supervisory unit on relationships, and not necessarily like peer-to-peer relationships, but more of the different people that students would interact with on a daily basis, like either at school, in the neighborhood, or at home. And so the point that we wanted to do with this is, I mean, some kids, you would assume that kids know how to react when they're in a restaurant or with a teacher or with their parents or things like that. But we wanted to kind of just go through and explain some of that in case students do miss that sort of thing while they're at home, because not all parents explain it.
Our first relationship is peer to sibling relationships, and we would have the teacher would act out in front of the class an argument between siblings, and they would take the role of both siblings to just grab the attention of their students. Then they would have a discussion as a class and talk about things that you fight with your siblings about, and some examples could be jealousy, you're spoiled, I'm not spoiled, teasing, competitiveness. And the students will be placed into groups of 2 where they will act out a siblings fight, and the groups could be positive or negative. And for every positive fight, that argument that is discussed, there will be a positive so that children know how they should act with their siblings. And then just the closure is that they will act the skit out in front of the class. And we will informally assess the students by how well they worked with their partner. And then we have a peer-to-peer relationship. And I actually did this in one of my classes when I was a student in 5th grade, and my teacher read us Lessons of Friendship out of the Chicken Soup for Teenage Soul book. And then she told us all to write our name down on a piece of paper, and we would pass each student would go around from the class and write a positive short phrase about you on your piece of paper, just like to boost your self-esteem. And then as a closure activity, pick interest group categories, and students that have the same interests, group them together so they can talk and get to know each other. But make sure that they're not talking about the same thing that they have in common. Make sure they're discussing different things. And then the teacher will pull students in and out of groups, allowing them to get to know different groups, not only the ones that they have the same interest with. And then once again, this will be informally assessed about how well they work together. And then there will be a formal assessment, and they'll write a journal about how they felt after they read all the phrases that the students said about them. Then we did a teacher-to-student relationship, and the teacher will go through a PowerPoint talking about different situations. And on the PowerPoint, we talked about homework issues, arguing in class, talking while others are talking, issues like that. And then we'll divide the students into groups of 3 or 4. Each group will have 2 different scenarios. And just as a closure activity, one person from each group will read their scenario to the whole class, and then they will discuss their solutions. And this will be informally assessed about how well they work together. Then we have a child-to-parent relationship, and we would open with showing a clip from the show Parenthood. And the teacher will talk about issues that they saw through the video. And the clip has issues about how the children feel like they're not loved. The parents don't let them do anything. And then there's some positives that some of the parents in the show have a weekly talk with their child. So there's some positive views. Then as the instructional activity, we'll have a discussion about issues that you have with your parents. And the students will rank the issues 1 through 10. There will be a discussion about why it's so hard to talk to your parents about specific issues. We said that you could be embarrassed, you don't know how your parents will respond, and you don't know how to talk to them. And then you can identify ways to make communication easier. We said that you could have nightly walks with your parents or talks each week, so just so that you can touch base and talk about things that have been going on in your life. And then finally, a student-to-staff relationship, and we would have a class discussion about the different jobs in the school outside of the teacher or administration. So maybe counselors or janitors or lunchroom helpers or bus drivers. And as the instructional activity would have students write down interview questions, and then the teacher will bring in the staff from the school so the students can actually interview themselves. And they could ask questions about what they like about their job, what do they hate, what maybe is their daily routine. And then each student will pick one of the jobs that they might be interested in, and they will write a short narrative about a day in the life of the specific job that they took. So then just an assessment would be formally looking at the interview questions that they wrote and how well that they wrote their paper.
And the next thing we decided to talk about were manners, and which might sound weird when you're talking about relationships with people, but if you think about it, if you have bad manners, it's really hard to build relationships with people, because I'm sure you all have had a conversation with somebody or tried to eat with somebody who like had bad either table manners or just speaking, or they don't get necessarily like social cues or something. So the focusing activity was the teacher would come in, like they would leave the classroom, get in character, and come back in and demonstrate some bad manners so that the students can see, maybe exaggerate them, so they can really tell like, oh, well that might not be right, or do I do that myself, that kind of thing, to get them thinking. And then for the actual activity part of it then, they'd go through in different stations, different groups, and for one there'd be like American table manners, because it's different from different countries, so that could be an interesting conversation with that too in the closing. Conversation skills, minding your P's and Q's, so making sure you remember to say thank you and please, and if you do something wrong, apologize, that kind of thing. And then being on time, because some students may not know like how to handle if they're going to be late and things like that. And so at each of these stations there would be like a list of some different guidelines that they could see of just general rules that could apply. And then the students in those groups, they'd be in small groups of like 3 or 4 at a time. And then they would come up with scenarios demonstrating poor manners and then demonstrating good manners too, so they can make up situations and see it go both ways. And then as part of the closing activity for the last part of it, they would write down any disagreements or amendments to the guidelines that were given at each station. So it gives them a chance to like explain why they disagree or why they agree with some of the things on there and what else they might add to it. So then for the closing activity, the teacher would have some of the students demonstrate the scenarios that they came up with, and then they would collect the students' amendments and disagreements as like an exit slip, or if the students didn't have enough time to do it during the activity, they could take it home to finish. And so the students would be assessed then on their participation and how much they tried to come up with different scenarios, and then based on their written responses of the amendments. And the next one kind of ties with that too, is etiquette in public. So this kind of goes along with manners and how you act like outside. So the thought for this kind of came from how would you interact in your neighborhood, or how in the different situations where you are. So the teacher would start by asking for like a brainstorming kind of thing of how many of you have been on an elevator or in a restaurant, a movie theater, or used the internet. Like those were the topics we decided to focus on. And then they would ask how many people have had the conversation, say with their parents or in different situations, about how you act. And if they hadn't, then how do you know how to act? So that would be an interesting way to figure out where the students are. And then I created a PowerPoint that kind of has some guidelines that they could go through and discuss, and whether or not they like agree with different things, or if they didn't know. Because some students I've seen, like they don't know that when you are going to get on the elevator, you have to let people off first. And so it's different things like that that is interesting and why we wanted to talk about it. And then as a closing activity, the teacher would have the students either like draw a picture or write a paragraph explaining something that they learned, or if they already knew all this kinds of stuff, like to make it as a summary sort of thing, to kind of sum up what they thought was important. And that would be, again, kind of like an exit slip to be a form of assessment then. So some questions like to think about for the assessment is like, did they actually learn anything, or like what information did they take away from it, so that you can kind of build off of that. And then another one we wanted to talk about was interacting with law enforcement, because we thought this would be interesting just to see like how students have, what they think is law enforcement and how they've had interactions with it. So for a fun way to start this, we could show a short video clip from Super Troopers, where they get pulled over in the car and they do the whole meow thing, just to show a different form of police etiquette. But we would talk about too how like this isn't necessarily a good scenario because they're not taking it seriously. And we put a note up here too, since the movie is rated R, but the clip is appropriate, we could send a form home saying like, you know, this is from this movie, but the part we're showing is not inappropriate, it's totally okay. So they could choose to watch it if they want to or not. And then they would analyze the video and look for different things like, okay, is there a procedure which the policeman follows, which there is? What do you have to give a police officer, say, if you get pulled over, because they demonstrate that in the video too. And then did both people take the situation seriously, and then why is that wrong? And then the students would go and they'd make a class list about what different law enforcement people they know. and like what they know as the job for each type of law enforcement. And then again, I had created a PowerPoint of different things like police officers, firefighters, judges, detectives, different things that students might know about or might see. And then while we would talk about that, it would be important to point out that law enforcement people are not bad people, that they're there to protect the citizens and protect everybody, because some students might have a situation where they'd say, well, the police took away my dad or my mom, and just to explain that they're there to protect everyone. And so say you did have a bad experience, you still have to give them respect because it's their job. And then to talk about, you know, calling 911 as a joke or not as an emergency is wrong and it's bad, and that it's really important to tell the truth if they were to ask you a question about trying to figure out what happened. And then the teacher would give the different, they go into groups and they do different situations, like what would you do when a police officer turns the light on behind your car? Then what happens? And then when you call 911, what should you be ready to tell them? Like where you are, stay calm, what's the emergency, that kind of thing. And then if you get in trouble, how should you act? So then the kids would come up with skits to kind of role play, and then they would demonstrate and volunteer to show that as a closing activity. So then they'd be assessed based on their participation and see how the students did during those. One of the other ones we did was reacting to people who come to the door, because some students don't know. In the instructional part, I found an article that talked about how some students would let a stranger into their house depending on what the stranger was asking, if they looked okay. So to start, I found a clip from a Swiffer commercial that would show different people who might come to your door. Like there was a mailman, there was somebody delivering flowers, there was the candygram, and so then the point for that would be to say, okay, if somebody were to come to your door, how do you know they're a bad person? How do you know they're dangerous? Because in those situations, they look like normal people, but they could be somebody who wants to do harm or do something bad. So then they would talk about why the students think they're dangerous, and then the teacher would talk about, the article talked about how a student had let an ABC person in because they asked to borrow the phone, and so the girl originally brought the phone outside, and then they said they couldn't hear, so she let the person inside, and they had the parents sitting in a car on the street, and the parents were shocked that they would happen. So to kind of talk about different situations, so we'd go through and make sure to like tell them that you need to look through a window or an eyepiece if you have it on your door. If there's a chain lock, try to keep it if you don't know who it is. Leave the door closed if possible, or just open it a crack if it's somebody you don't know, and never let anybody in your house that you don't know. So then, then you'd have the students get in pairs, and then come up with some dialogue and have one person pretend to be somebody coming to the door and someone being the student, and then having them decide whether to be dangerous or not. So then they would have volunteers demonstrate what they talked about, and then before they'd leave, you'd have them sign like and create a behavior contract to say, like, to pledge to try to be more careful when people do approach your door. And then they would be assessed on their role playing. And then the last one we talked about was interacting with neighbors. So for the focusing activity, you could talk about nice things you've done or what things that neighbors do that bother you. And then, for example, like I pulled up the Naperville Ordinance website that just talked about different rules and regulations for your neighborhood. 5 minutes? Okay. And so I just have them listed here, some of the different things, like if you have block parties with your neighbors, like the guidelines for that, animal control. And then they would come up with lists and regulations kind of and how they want their ideal neighborhood to be and how they interact with the people in their neighborhood. And then they'd write a couple of the regulations down as an exit slip. And then they'd be assessed based on their participation and then what they talked about. So then our assessment we did for the overall thing was going to be a short essay format so they could explain how they would react. And so we just have some of these listed up here. I won't read through all of them, but they're different situations like in school, at home, your manners, and interacting with different people around you.
Okay, and we're going to do the peer-to-peer activity. So if you all